I won't do too much of an intro. I think Sanjeev has already introduced me very much, and where it's useful, I will be actually discussing some of the work that I've been doing. I want to start with a character trait of mine. When I'm trying to describe a topic, I have this tendency that I want to be complete in my analysis, and that's what I try to do in my book, Replacing GDP by 2030. And so from around 2004, I've been following international conferences, following the literature, and there's this ever-growing body of indicators, dashboards that Sanjeev was talking about. And this is just a, let me see whether I can, yeah. So this is actually a summary of the indexes that I found, or the dashboards. They're actually all named in my annex because, as I said, I like to be quite thorough in my analysis, but actually I had to, at some stage, think about, well, I really can't be complete. If you look at the last 50 years or so, there have been so many suggestions on how to replace this powerful indicator, GDP, that we have, which inspires many books. And there have been so many suggestions by very prominent economists, Nobel Prize winners, many people, institutes, NGOs have created an index. And in the early part of my career, I was very enthusiastic about this dynamic. And every time I found out about a new index, there was a certain elation about understanding how they had measured it, what their theory was. But at some stage, I must say, it started to become an irritation. This cloud of indexes and dashboards seemed to be, from a communication standpoint, a real problem. What exactly are we as a community communicating, and can we really even speak of a community if this is the message that we're sending? And so I've basically thought, well, I want to use my career and my thinking process not to develop a new index. I think actually it would be great if a lot of people in this field would agree that let's not develop any new indices, but let's try and consolidate the knowledge that has been around for 50 years or so. There are so many great ideas, and perhaps we are looking constantly towards the more indicators rather than consolidation and harmonization. And it took me a while to articulate exactly why this cloud irritates me so much. And I guess the first part is terminology. There is just so much terminology, which in some cases perhaps are just synonyms. So we haven't really been able to congregate around certain terms that are vital to the debate. The second aspect, and I think anybody who has been involved in this debate will recognize this, is that there are very many methodological debates. So anybody that's had a coffee at a conference will have this discussion. Well, are you for an index? Can you actually measure beyond GDP in one single number? Or are you camp dashboards, which says, well, it's impossible to weigh all these things, all these various aspects of beyond GDP. So I'm for camp dashboard. And the other debates are around, well, what are the foundation of your dashboard or index? Are they scientific? But even if they're scientific, they could be from kind of mainstream economics, welfare economics. There are heterodox economics like happiness economics, or the capability approach by Sen. There's other social sciences which have contributed to the literature. And especially in the field of sustainability, for example, the natural sciences, of course, also have kind of suggestions. And then there's the group which says, well, basically, it's not really something that science should be doing, but it's very much a stakeholder or political process whereby either politicians or the general public should actually decide what is beyond GDP. And I think the SDGs are the primary example of this. So the metaphor which I sometimes use when I compare the third aspect which kind of irritates me is that actually because I guess also this terminology and methodology is so confusing, it's sometimes also difficult to dispel what is the actual message which we are getting from all these indicators. What is the bottom line of, how are things developing? What exactly are we trying to convey? Which message are we trying to convey? And the metaphor which I quite often use is that of the GDP multinational, which is a globally coordinated and coherent community, I would say. I will argue in a moment. And then we have this beyond GDP cottage industry where there are many institutes, many scientists, NGOs, basically providing alternatives. So that's the setup. So as you can see, I'm looking at this from a very broad perspective, and I do realize that especially in this audience, there will be economists who would define beyond GDP more narrowly, basically look at it more from a mainstream economics perspective. So if we look at that perspective, then there's a huge amount of literature, development methodologies that are looking at either at a better measurement of the economy. I think we have been looking at quality adjustments for government, health, educational services for many, many years, decades even. More recently, work has been very prevalent on free goods and services, digital services, intangibles, where there was a conference last week, also organized by ESCoE. Then there is a group or a portion of the literature that really takes an externality approach to this issue and also goes beyond, I think, what we would say are economic boundaries. So, for example, Nordhaus and Tobin back in the early 70s created the measure of economic welfare, where they basically said, well, consumption is a good start, but really if we should be correcting for positive and negative externalities, such as leisure time, environmental damages, and all the positive and negative externalities that are not measured by consumption. I think one of the most famous ones here currently is the Genuine Progress Indicator, but there are actually, I think, around a dozen or so that I have in the annex of my book. Then there's a third type of, I would say, mainstream economic approaches, which are based really on this capital approach, whereby we say, well, if we're thinking about sustainability, we should be thinking about the wealth that we're leaving future generations. So it's really about measuring the assets, the natural capital, human capital, produced capital. And that really is what we're trying to do. I think a really important paper there was by Pearson Atkinson, which proposed this genuine savings indicator, and also work from the World Bank, who I also work for this publication called The Changing Wealth of Nations, which was published just a couple of weeks ago. And the United Nations publishes this Inclusive Wealth Index. And of course, there's this project in Cambridge about the wealth economy, which is also, I think, in this field. And already in the ESCoE field, there are also a number of publications also in this domain dealing with one or more of these approaches. Now, it's tempting to start discussing the content and the methodologies of all these things, but I want really to focus our attention on the three irritations that I had above, which were the coherence in terminology, in terms of methodology, and also message. Now, again, in terms of terminology, even though we're not defining beyond GDP in a very broad sense, this is just purely mainstream economics mostly. Really, there are many different acronyms, many different names and terminology which are bandied around. Just think about comprehensive wealth, which is published by the World Bank, or inclusive wealth, which is published by the United Nations. I don't actually think that conceptually there's very much difference between those, but there apparently is no room for agreement on what we would call a broader wealth measure. And I'm also interested in terms of the message, given that the World Bank, for example, publishes this human capital estimates. I think the UN will publish them, and probably also in the Cambridge project, there will also be measurement of human capital, for example. I'm very curious to see whether actually those three estimates will actually provide the same message actually when they are published. So I'm looking at the Beyond GDP very much from a communications perspective, rather than simply focusing on debates within the Beyond GDP domain. So what I want to do in this talk today is I want to talk about economies and coherence first. How did economics become coherent? And I realized that this might be a little bit of a stretch for some people. I think it was Churchill who said, if you have two economists, there will be three opinions. I believe it was in reaction to Lord Keynes. So it's not perhaps obvious why I think that economists are coherent, but I will try to argue that. The second aspect is that I really do believe there needs to be some kind of synthesis, some kind of coherence brought to Beyond GDP. And this is the interdisciplinary synthesis that I'm proposing. And the third is, of course, well, what does that then mean for economic measurements? And those are the three aspects that I want to discuss. So let's start with the first one. The subtext. Yeah, one of my ulterior motives for doing this presentation is to really get into contact also with people that know knew Richard Stone. You will see that in my presentation, actually, a lot of what I'm proposing, I think, is actually a continuation of his work. And he is very prevalent, I think, in what I'm suggesting. So if there are people that intimately know about the history or the biography of Richard Stone, I would actually really love to be in contact. So the first thing is about this economies and coherence. This is a graph from my book showing the number of countries with national income. And there's basically two sources that I use. There's Studentsky, which is kind of an encyclopedia of all the national income measures that have been created before 1958, the hundreds of years before that. And then after the war, the UN started collecting data, so you can actually count how many countries provided data to the United Nations. And we're now used to the situation that there were 200 countries with GDP or national income measures. But actually in 1900, there were only 9 countries that had ever measured their national income. Now, I don't want to rehash the whole history of national income accounting, although I'm really interested in it. But I just want to look at it from a coherence perspective. I think we all know that in 1953, Richard Stone and of course colleagues from other statistical offices created the system of national accounts. And as a thought experiment, I'd like you just to think about what consequences that had. I would describe the pre-SNA situation very much as a GDP cottage industry, very similar to the situation we have now with Beyond-GDP. And that is that basically there were many different ways of measuring national income, many different very prominent macroeconomists. Here in the Netherlands, we had Tinbergen, for example. We had the Scandinavian school, Canada, US. There were many different ways, really, of measuring a national income. Now, what would have happened if actually there was no harmonization process such as the system of national accounts? Just imagine what would have happened if basically every country just had their own macroeconomic statistics, their own macroeconomic policy models. I think it's fairly obvious that the coherence of macroeconomics would have been a lot less in that situation. And to drive that point home, I guess the GDP multinational, as I call it, is quite a remarkable logistical process. There are statistical offices, and I've put up the flags of the 5 countries that I've actually lived in my life, but in 200 countries in total, there are institutes that are responsible for retrospective statistics. There are policy institutes, university, ministries that are looking at the modeling and policies that we might imply from macroeconomic statistics. Then there's, of course, the media, which actually uses these statistics and policy outcomes in their communication. And there's the general public, which, of course, is also part of this conversation. And what is remarkable is that I think this community is very much bound by this system of national accounts, which Richard Stone created. So I think we're used to kind of thinking about the system of national accounts as a really useful accounting framework, but I actually see it more as a dictionary where we classified, or macroeconomics kind of converge around certain terminology that we would be using when we are discussing the macroeconomy. And in fact, it's even more than a dictionary. It's perhaps also a grammar book, in the sense that it also shows the relationships between the various words. And in that sense, I see the system of national accounts more as a language which connects all these different domains of society. And of course, there's many accents and dialects which are spoken, but to a very large extent, there is a coherent foundation to these discussions. Now, I think where the confusion comes from, and perhaps also this criticism from Churchill about economists not being very coherent, is that there are areas that economists really agree on. So this terminology and methodology, I think, are mostly agreed upon, although there's obviously always debate, but it's not one of the primary aspects, I think, of macroeconomics. But I think where the economists do differ very significantly is not so much how to measure the economy or whether the economy is growing or not, but rather on why is the economy growing and will it keep growing in the future, or what policies might be implemented. And that, of course, is where macroeconomists can differ very, very significantly on their message. So I think this resonates perhaps in a statistics and a policy setting, but I'm also really interested in how this then translates and spreads in society through the media, for example. So I've been doing quite a bit of research on the New York Times, and this actually also to link certain aspects of this GDP multinational, as I call it, to certain articles in the New York Times. So these are two articles that were published last year. Setting is around the election, and you know, the US had just gone through the first wave, I think, of the COVID crisis, and so the first one is based on the statistics from the Department of Commerce, or a statistical institute which publishes GDP every quarter. And the second is based on a policy institute. And from a linguistic perspective, it's really interesting to actually see, you know, something that's statistical or scientific or policy model, how that then is translated into words by journalists. I won't go through all of them, but one of the interesting aspects of the second title, for example, is that the word economy doesn't actually even occur in that title. So we have been trained that actually when we see the word recovery, basically the adjective economic becomes kind of redundant, because when we talk about recovery, you know, it's more than likely that we are talking about economic recovery. So to a certain extent, the reader has been already primed and is already also learning economic language, and is assumed to have this kind of economic understanding. And that also brought me to the New York Times archives, where I've been investigating how economic terminology has actually been spreading. So this is the percentage of articles that have the word economy in them. And interestingly, in the Great Depression, at the peak of the Great Depression, only 2.5% really of the articles had the word economy in them. And this was absolutely the greatest calamity, economic calamity of the 20th century. And as you can see, what kind of happens is that every time we have economic turmoil, the term continues or peaks, and it's actually peaked at this moment at around 15% in 2020 during the main moments of the COVID pandemic. But there is kind of a secular increase, I would say, of the words economy in New York Times articles. So in a sense, we have been getting used to words like the economy, which were not actually that prevalent in the 1920s. Now, to what extent is this due to this coherence or to GDP? I think that's a more difficult question, and I'm trying to kind of link the two. One thing I can conclude or show you is that these are the number of mentions of various words since 2010. So just over a decade, I would say, of New York Times articles. And a word like economy has been mentioned in around 6,000 articles. Now, if you gauge that around 300 days in a year, there's an edition of the New York Times, that translates to around 20 times that the economy is mentioned in the New York Times per day. Economic growth around 3 times a day. And as you can see, even things like gross domestic product and GDP are mentioned at least every day in the New York Times. And to my mind, I do think it has to do with this GDP, this organization really that has been created. And I also am able to contrast it to, you know, our most successful indicators in Beyond-GDP. The Human Development Index is mentioned around 6 times every year in the New York Times, so once every 8 or 9 weeks. And things like the Genuine Progress Indicator, which are really popular amongst environmental economists, for example, basically once a year. And so, to my mind, we should be thinking far more about the global message that we're sending in terms of Beyond-GDP. And we should be really thinking about, can we create some kind of coherence in terms of terminology, methodology, and message? So that's the second part of my presentation, of the interdisciplinary synthesis, which I would like to propose. And that is firstly to say, well, what exactly would bind Beyond-GDP? How could we make that cloud of indexes and dashboards? Are there some common threads in their thinking? We know that, you know, there's criticism of GDP. I think it's fairly clear that GDP will remain a really important indicator in our society. But at the same time, I think there is a lot of agreement that GDP is important, but it's not the goals that you would want for society. And that's where I think the synthesis has some fairly obvious literature and literature that we can point to. So the first is, I think, which is very seminal, is of course the Brundtland report, which defines sustainable development in terms of the present generation and the future generation. So very much this distinction between the present and the future. And of course, there was also a lot of discussion of inequalities between countries and inequalities within countries. But I think it's most remembered for this distinction. Now, I also think that the Stiglitz report is really foundational in our understanding of Beyond-GDP. And I think this is one of the key things that they said, and that is that sustainability and current well-being are actually 2 very separate things. So understanding the well-being here and now is actually a very different thing than understanding the future sustainability. And they even are fairly explicitly critical of indexes which actually combine current well-being and sustainability into a single indicator. So they basically are already saying, well, let's look at these 2 dimensions separately. Now, the third strand of literature, which I think is very foundational, actually builds on this inequality ideas that are already also in the Brundtland report and the Stiglitz report. And that is that inequality is also a really important aspect which GDP doesn't cover, but which are very important in our discussions. So just looking at these seminal publications, I think you know, a fairly easy way to think of this is that basically there's 3 dimensions of success, and these are also the basis upon which GDP is often criticized. So first is this current well-being, so quality of life or welfare, whatever you want to call it. Then there's the sustainability aspect, so the future, and there's these equity dimensions to it, which can be either global. So Branko Milanovic, for example, looks at people from the perspective of, you know, let's line up all the people of the world without really looking at the nation states. But there is, of course, a lot of literature on differences between countries. And also there's a lot of work on within country inequalities. And I do want to stress again, I'm not for exactly eradicating GDP, but I do think so that will remain an important indicator for all types of economic policies. But at the same time, in terms of when we're defining the dimensions of success of a society, I think it would boil down to these three dimensions. And of course, the economy plays an important role in actually creating these phenomena. Now, it turns out that distinction of well-being, sustainability, and equity also helps you to look at that cloud of indices, for example, and really helps you to think about where do they fit. So, for example, when we're thinking about well-being, there are various options. First is a general progress indicator, which is, as I said, is very much this externality approach. Now, I do need to clarify that sometimes the general progress indicator, some applications do in fact include things such as CO2 emissions. So there is also an aspect of sustainability, but there are also applications where we're basically just looking at current well-being. So that's why I've classified it here. Then the Human Development Index, which was created by Amartya Sen, which is based on the capability approach and looks at income, health, and education as a basis for capability measurements. And I think also one that's very well known is subjective well-being, whereby people are simply asked in a questionnaire to score their life satisfaction or their happiness on a certain scale. Now, what I find interesting about these things is that they're actually just methods from various different scientific disciplines. So general progress indicator is very much this welfare economics, mainstream economics, and we would, I guess, call that valuation. And capability approach, hedonic psychology, happiness economics, it's sometimes perhaps also called. But these are not necessarily mainstream economic approaches, but more broadly heterodox or other social sciences which have created them. So rather than calling it valuation approaches, I generally try to call it evaluation methodologies, and whereby welfare economics is actually evaluation methodology. So the second aspect, this is actually that I'm still working on slightly. The equity dimension is quite slightly more difficult because there are also very many parameters. So in these domains of the global, between country and within country inequities, there is, of course, many summary statistics that can be used. Gini coefficients can be used. And those can be used for income, where we know them most often, but they can also be used for other personal indicators. And of course, there are also additional groupings that you could think of in terms of gender, age, or background, which are part of the equity debate. The third aspect is sustainability. And as I said, comprehensive wealth and inclusive wealth are these capital approaches where we use neoclassical welfare economics to actually look at the value of certain capital stocks. And so that's very much from a mainstream perspective. And then there is, of course, also different perspectives from a more ecological or a standpoint, such as the ecological overshoot measures, where the ecological footprint is basically translating our consumption into land area, and then we are defining, what kind of, how many earths, for example, do we need to for our consumption. So that's a very different perspective to welfare economics, but it is a sustainability index which is proposed. Now, this is just just a number of the indices, but actually I think this split into these 3 dimensions actually helps you to classify loads of the indicators, dashboards, and indexes that I presented in that cloud. Now, in terms of the message, so I was talking about clarity in terms of terminology. So I would actually say that well-being, equity, and sustainability are perhaps pretty good catch-all labels for a lot of these indicators, and might help us actually to get towards some kind of harmonization. The other aspect is, well, do they actually provide a different message? Does it help us to classify these indicators into various domains? So the first one is, I'm creating at the moment a database of all these various indexes. And what you see here is the 3 indexes for well-being that I've defined. So there's subjective well-being, which is the score of people, which are asked through surveys, which is from the World Database of Happiness. There's the Human Development Index from the UNDP. And then there's a general progress indicator, which has been done by a Belgian PhD student. It's slightly different to the normal general progress indicator, but it's fairly similar in terms of methodology. Now, as you can see, actually subjective well-being and human development do provide a fairly consistent view. And the economic approach does also show an increase in these well-being indexes, but it is slightly more volatile and also increases faster, I would say. Now, if we look at sustainability indexes that I proposed, then if you look at the capital approach, comprehensive wealth, the sum of all these different capital stocks, then it does actually show an increase over time. So from that perspective, the amount of assets that we are gaining is actually increasing. And when you look at it from a perspective such as the ecological footprint, the message is very different in the sense that there we are measuring on the right side of the on the right y-axis, we are measuring the number of Earths of overshoot that UK consumption has actually led to. And there you can see we are the UK is very much in the negative there. So actually in this case, in the case of well-being indexes, there was fairly consistent in terms of growth, for example, over the larger portion. And here, the 2 indexes are in fact showing something very different. Now, that often leads to the discussion, and it's kind of a scientific discussion. Well, what is the best one? When you're looking at well-being, would you propose a welfare economics approach, like a general progress indicator? Is the capability approach better, or hedonic psychology? And then you would get a debate about, well, this one is, this one has these great attributes. And then others would say, well, yeah, but welfare economics, although it has a huge history, it also has a lot of problems when it comes to social issues or the long term. And you can go through a list of the various problems and advantages of all the different systems. And to a certain extent, I wonder whether it's really useful to ask which is the best method of aggregating this term well-being. And to illustrate why perhaps that is a bit of a weird question, I have a metaphor which I call the tricorder. And what I want you to think about is what happens actually when we're diagnosing a disease. When somebody is ill, we have various scientific evaluation methods to actually judge whether, what disease, is somebody healthy or not? And if so, what is actually ailing them. So you can have, blood pressure meter, you can have blood testing, you can have an echo to see whether there are certain problems that you can see with an ultrasound. And to illustrate how strange that discussion is about which is the best method, a doctor would always say, well, it depends. It depends on the disease that you are trying to, or that the person has. So in some cases, if there is no higher temperature, then a thermometer is fairly useless. But a thermometer is great, of course, if there are symptoms of a high temperature, for example. And I guess it becomes even more absurd if you say, well, which is the best method? Because after we have chosen the best method, we're actually going to throw away the insights from the other approaches, and we're just going to use that single instrument. So it'll be a little bit like advising that all doctors should use a thermometer in future, because we've kind of decided that that's the best instrument to use. And that, I think, also, I think the metaphor hopefully is obvious, that I actually believe that we should be using all the interdisciplinary knowledge we have, whether it's welfare economics, capability approach, or hedonic psychology. I think we should be actually using all three dimensions, because they are all have advantages and disadvantages. Now, why do I call this the Tricorder? I was actually doing this presentation a year ago, where somebody said there is actually an instrument which does measure health perfectly, and it's called the Tricorder. And I didn't know this, but apparently in the science fiction Star Trek series, there is actually a doctor who has this instrument called the Tricorder, and it does perfectly diagnose a disease just based on one instrument. So in a sense, I think when we are debating this question, which is the best method, we are actually trying to convince each other that we have created a Tricorder, where I think we should just resign ourselves to the fact that there are just many different ways, many imperfect ways of measuring these phenomenon, without actually pretending that we can create a Beyond-GDP Tricorder. So this was the synthesis of, what indicator might replace GDP, or what indicators might actually replace GDP from this interdisciplinary perspective. But I do think it's important to realize that Richard Stone didn't just create an indicator, GDP, but actually he created an entire accounting system upon which all macroeconomic, or a lot of macroeconomic modeling is also based. So I do think we need to go that step further and also look beyond SNA, so to speak. And there again, I do actually think that Richard Stone already taught us basically how to think about these things. In the early 1970s, Richard Stone actually did some consulting work, I think, for the OECD, which were called the social and demographic accounts. And he specifically studied population and education. And I think that's also where the notion came from, that accounting is actually much more broader than just monetary accounting. In his Nobel Prize lecture, for example, he said that basically anything, all accounting is just a matter of stocks and flows. And that can be for goods and services, human beings, or natural resources. All of these things, whether you measure them in value or in physical terms, basically all of this is accounting. And I think the most successful example of this is the system of environmental and economic accounts, which has a history which started in the early 1990s as kind of a process where we started to congregate around how to measure environmental accounting. And what's interesting when you compare kind of the 93 version to the 2014 version, which became a statistical standard, really the early 93 version was very much geared towards finding this green GDP, so to speak. And as you read the various versions of this manual, you will find that basically by 2014, there's a very definite split between physical accounting, so measuring emissions, extraction, flows, all these things in physical terms or energy terms, and separating that from the economic evaluation, which is also a part of the system of economic accounts. And at this moment, actually, I think around 100 countries have adopted this system. In the EU, it's actually compulsory. And what's even better is, I think, that actually because this has become a standard, it has also become the basis of a lot of environmental and economic modeling. And the third development, which I think is really interesting over the last 10 years or so, is the development of multi-regional input-output tables. Now, input-output we know now as being a part of national accounting, but actually in the 1953 ESCoE, it wasn't in there. I think Richard Stone introduced Leontief's work on input-output, or integrated that into the ESCoE in 1968. And for a very long time, it was normal to just look at input-output as a national statistic. But since around 15 years or so, we have been getting more and more multi-regional input-output tables, which are looking at the economy from a global perspective. Yesterday, there was the OECD TIVA presentation. I think some of you might have gone there. And what is even more interesting is that also what we are seeing is that a lot of these databases are adding labor data, environmental accounting data to these tables.
Rutger?
Yeah?
Nudge, 2-3 minutes, thanks.
Okay. Well, I basically want to say that I believe that basically what Richard Stone already indicated, that we can account for the environment, we can account for society, and we can have accounts for the economy. And in fact, for many of these domains, we already have these systems in place. I think in the area of society, there is a bit of work to be done on demographic accounts and on time use accounts. But actually, we have a lot of the indicator or a lot of the accounting systems basically already exist. And now what is the relationship between the indicators that I was discussing? Well, I'll skip these two and basically say that if we view these accounts as being the accounting systems for, physical things like materials, energy, leisure time, jobs, health, then actually, if we look at the interdisciplinary evaluation lens that I showed you, actually these data can be translated into indexes that are based on welfare economics or capability approach or hedonic psychology or even planetary boundaries. And actually, people that are interested more in economic valuation can use that to create genuine progress indicators and comprehensive wealth measures. But actually, there is a much larger availability of evaluation methods, as I call it. So what are the implications for economic measurement? Firstly, I think that Richard Stone actually has taught us a lot, which we can actually use going forward. Accounting, one of the things that he also stressed in this Nobel Prize lecture is that accounting is basically everywhere and not just in money. And I think it's important to actually split this accounting to actually valuation, or perhaps more broadly, evaluation. And the fourth thing I would like to say is that probably in terms of environmental accounting and economic accounting, we still have loads of work to do, but that's very much work that's already well advanced, especially in the societal accounts. I think there's quite a bit of work to be done. I also think that national statistical offices need to start thinking of their work in a global accounting framework. And finally, I hope I've tried to convince you that we do need some kind of push towards terminological and methodological harmonization. And that can be with a narrow focus, where you only focus on economic valuation and kind of these mainstream welfare economic approaches, or it could be this broader focus where we call it interdisciplinary evaluation. Now, just one more slide, just to talk about a project that I'm leading at Leiden University. Basically, what we want to do there is make the data, as I showed them for the UK, available in one location. So make Beyond-GDP data available. We'll be presenting databases from 1990, hopefully in a month. We also want to show the long-term trajectories of these indicators, and we also want to create nowcasts, although that will take some expertise and some time. We also will be developing these accounting systems, as I call them. And on top of that, we also want to try the first experiments with wise policy models, which we're calling them, so well-being, sustainability, and equity. Thanks a lot. I hope I haven't gone over the time too much, but I'm happy to answer any questions or queries that people have.
Thank you, Rutger. As expected, an excellent expose. There's a lot of breadth and depth covered there. I do like the terminology, methods, and message dimension. You've got me an advocate on that one, as you know, having experience answering questions in the past. I think you're right to draw out the element of the indicator, the framework, and the dashboard for sure. I think the notion of replacing GDP with an indicator, to me, is almost like a holy grail. We'll probably never get there. Therefore, let's think other and get. But there's a lot of people who still think there's an indicator, but national accounts, like you say, has got a lot of other information. And we look at the accounting framework. I think it's also just worth mentioning the SNA, as you're probably aware, we're updating with the BPM, etc. And just recently, I would say there's now an appetite for giving a lot more prominence to net indicators. And that just shows that the door's ajar. So we're making progress. You're right with the Churchill scenario. So I'm going to leave a hook there for you whilst I go to the other questions, encouraging people to use the QA for their questions. Is obviously Churchill had a lot of economists, and then he had a lot of departments giving him lots of controversial data, different data, and he wanted a single statistical office. But if you had your choice, what one or two or three at most additions would you have to the SNA framework in terms of your indicators? I'll let you think about that for the moment. I just want to mention it before I open up the quick QA part, is the next seminar will be on the 2nd of December this year on natural capital accounting. I had to pause for a moment to get those words right. And it'll be by a colleague of mine, Adam Dutton, from the Office for National Statistics. So I'm now going to go to the QA. I'll come back to you. Don't worry, Rutger, you're not off the hook. I will start with Abigail Coxon, and in the spirit of time, we've got about 10 minutes. Abigail, we're going to see if we can unmute you if you want to ask your question. Just pause for a moment. Are you able to unmute, Abigail?
I think it looks unmuted, yeah.
If not, I'll ask it then. Do you still think we can use GDP when the main element is consumption, which for products will always require some level of depletion and waste? How do you think the conflict in terms of trade-off between sustainability and consumption can be reconciled? Back to you, Rutger.
Yeah, so to my mind, GDP is still a useful measure because it's kind of a means to an end. You know, having a healthy economy is, of course, important foundation for society. So, but what I find is that what does tend to happen, is that we then start to equate consumption with environmental damages, for example. And to my mind, it would be more useful to actually compare well-being to sustainability. Consumption is already kind of a portion of well-being. You know, it can lead to well-being, but there are so many other factors which are contributing to well-being. And I think the real aim of policy, or something that's actually in the US Constitution, is the pursuit of happiness. So I actually think we should be looking more towards the relationship between well-being and sustainability. And actually then also different things might pop up, different solutions. I mean, there's a lot of discussion now about the 4-hour or 4-day work week. Sorry, not the 4-hour work week, but the 4-day work week. And that might actually lead to an increase in well-being, a lowering of consumption because of income drops, and an increase in sustainability. And that's an analysis that you couldn't get if you actually related consumption to sustainability, because then you would say, well, you know, a 4-hour work week leads to less income, leads to lower consumption, so it's a negative. And when you look at it from a more broad perspective, we are actually all trying to live a life of well-being. And that's probably the real goal, the real measure of success, so to speak.
Thanks, Rutger. I'm going to see if Michael Joffe can be connected so he can unmute, and if he can briefly ask his question. But in the meantime, yeah, many years ago, there used to be the concept of a 3-day week. Still not materialized, but I'm not so sure if the trade unions would appreciate that. But whilst we wait for Michael, I'd also say I've found that many of the frameworks that are coming to replace stuff, they need to be thinking about avoiding double counting, triple counting, quadruple counting, because I've seen certain things that actually amplify the scenario. So I'm going to go to Michael now. Hopefully you're unmuted and you can hopefully...
I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Michael.
Good. I really appreciate the synthesis and your vision, and you well represented the sustainability and, to an extent, inequality perspectives in your review. But I think myself that much of the unease with GDP is actually motivated by the question, what should the economy be for? And one answer to that has been monitoring well-being, but it hasn't proved very useful for policy or evaluation. I think this movement is actually somewhat incoherent. I agree with you on that. Should we rather be monitoring those outputs of the economy, things like access to housing and livelihoods, their quality, security, and things like that really matter to people? They largely determine health and well-being. So the important words there are determine health and well-being rather than as the outcomes themselves. And health as well as well-being is very important. That would be complementary to things like GDP and the monitoring of assets that you've highlighted in your review. So it's a complementarity idea.
Michael, before you go, can you just mention where your affiliation, please?
Yes, I'm based at Imperial College.
Thank you. Over to you, Rutger.
Yeah, I think I probably agree with a lot of this, especially this kind of subtle interpretation of GDP as a measure of well-being, which, you know, you might even argue for a lot of history that there was a lot of correlation between well-being and GDP. So to a certain extent, there is a correlation in certain time periods, so to speak. And a lot of the empirics kind of suggest that there was also a bit of a disconnect between the two, starting from perhaps the 1970s or so in the developed world. But I guess that's a debate that you could have many dimensions on. One of the things that I do find useful is that as economists, I'm an environmental economist as well, and we're kind of used to working from the economy outwards. So thinking about, well, what didn't we measure, those kind of things. And as a thought experiment, I found it really useful to start thinking the other way around. So start thinking first of the global environment, carbon cycles, nitrogen cycles, resources all over the world. Then think about society, a little bit like Stone's work from the early 70s. Think about population. What is their health status, their education, those kind of things? No valuation yet at all, but just think about the statistical accounting involved. And then after that, go to the economy. And what I found is that if you try and think of outward in, you actually get to different answers than if you're thinking inward out, so to speak. And I think it's actually a nice philosophical approach to actually try both approaches and see where you end up.
Thanks for that, Rutger. I mean, I agree with that. What I find amazing is not enough from the outward in challenges what's being done. It's almost like what's being done in is taken verbatim as the gospel, but actually there's lots of inconsistency and incoherence that could be achieved. I'm going to move to Paul Allen next, if we can get you unmuted. And Paul, if you can then quickly raise your question. And I think that will probably be the last one, given where we are on time.
Hi, thanks Sanjeev, and thank you, Richard. Lots of interesting thoughts there, lots of things to think about. I just thought, though, you were speaking mainly for seeing this as a kind of supply side perspective. There are all these indicators. Let's rationalize them. Could you say a bit more about kind of looking at this from the demand for this information? How do we know what these things are for, and how could we actually involve more people in the conversation?
Yeah.
And Paul, before you disappear, where are you nowadays?
Oh, sure. So I'm also based at Imperial, but I'm really wearing my hat here as chair of the Statistics User Forum.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Over to you, Rutger.
Yeah. So first on the supply side, I talk to quite a few journalists about this topic, and what I find is there is also just misunderstanding sometimes amongst journalists, and you'll have to talk them through half an hour of, well, this indicator is measuring this and that. So I do think on the supply side, we should just be doing a far better job, for example, of explaining to journalists exactly what these things are. They're used to GDP, they don't need, they've just had it in their education system, but we're not really making it easier for them to supply the general public with this information, so to speak. So I do think there still is a supply issue, which I think is really important. But as you say, there are also very many Beyond-GDP approaches which are looking more at the deliberative side and stakeholder analysis, those kind of things. I do have some thoughts on how you could do this, because this is my proposal is very much still a science-based approach where we have an interdisciplinary synthesis. I think what's really interesting is actually the climate change debates. What you saw there was also a synthesis in the early 1990s of climate science. So scientists coming together in the IPCC and getting a message out. And what I find so interesting about that is that then, although quite delayed, there is this climate movement like 2 or 3 years ago of people that are basically saying, listen to the scientists, climate change is a problem. And so sometimes I think there's an interaction between science and society, which we could also tap into, but it does start with a very clear, coherent vision from scientists. And that's why I've also, in my book, I actually spoke about an intergovernmental panel on Beyond-GDP, because we do need some kind of coherence towards larger society. And if we just keep expanding the number of indexes and dashboards and not cooperating in any way, I really do not think we'll ever really have an impact on the streets and on deliberations in society.
Thanks for that, Rutger. I would definitely agree with that. I definitely want to also end up with a comment from Julian Hatt to say that was a fabulous presentation. Summarizes it really well. So thank you very much for your presentation and the questions from the questioners. And what I'd also say is just to remind you, the next webinar will be on the 2nd of December, and more details will be out shortly. And so on that note, I would say bid you good day, and I'll bring this to a close. Thank you very much. Okay, goodbye.
Thanks.